Part 3, Answering Dating Objections. Of all the objections I expect from the scholarly community, this is probably where the strongest reaction will come. It's one thing to question interpretations, challenge assumptions, or propose alternative contexts, but here we're stepping into something much more foundational. We're not just debating what the Dead Sea Scrolls mean, or questioning how they've been dated in the first place. The dating of the scrolls is not a minor detail, it is the standard narrative. It is the backbone of it. Nearly everything scholars believe about the scrolls depend on the assumptions that dating methods used are reliable. If those methods hold, then the broader framework holds with them. But if these methods are weaker than they're presented to be, or if they've been applied with more uncertainty than is often acknowledged, then the entire structure starts to look far less secure. In the chapters that follow, we're going to take a close look at the two primary methods used to date the scrolls, paleography and carbon dating. These are often treated as independent lines of evidence that reinforce each other, creating the impression of a solid and well-established timeline. But that confidence deserves to be examined, not just accepted. None of this is to say that these methods are useless or should be dismissed outright. They can provide valuable information, but they are not infallible, and they are not as precise as they are sometimes treated. The problem is the level of confidence placed in them without fully acknowledging their limitations. So, in these next chapters, the goal is not simply to reject paleography and carbon dating, but to test them, to look at how they work, where they succeed, and where they fall short. Because if the dating methods themselves are uncertain, then the conclusions built on top of them have to be reconsidered as well, and that is where the real tensions begin. Chapter 17, Paleography. Paleography, the practice of dating manuscripts by the appearance of their handwriting, is frequently presented as a neutral and largely objective scientific discipline. In textbooks and reference works, it is often described as a technical skill rooted in careful observation, comparative analysis, and long familiarity with ancient scripts. Within the study of ancient texts, and especially in the fields of biblical studies and Second Temple Judaism, paleography has come to function not merely as a descriptive tool, but as a primary chronological anchor. This role is most clearly visible in the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and early biblical manuscripts. In the absence of explicit dates, coliforms, or securely stratified archaeological context, paleographic assessment is regularly invoked to supply the missing chronology. When radiocarbon data is unavailable, inconclusive, or inconsistent, paleography is often presented as the stabilizing method, the discipline capable of narrowing broad historical uncertainty into confined date ranges. As a result, entire textual reconstructions, historical models, and theological narratives are routinely built upon paleographic conclusions. Such confidence, I argue, is misplaced, particularly for manuscripts assigned to the centuries surrounding the turn of the era. Paleography does not measure time directly. It does not detect years, decades, or generations. It infers chronology from visual resemblance, operating on the assumption that handwriting styles developed in a relatively linear and traceable progression. That assumption becomes increasingly fragile the further one moves from periods with abundant, securely dated material. As the comparative record thins, paleography ceases to function as an independent method and instead becomes dependent on inherited frameworks and prior assumptions. At that point, what appears to be objective dating becomes a closed system of reinforcement. Manuscripts are dated because they resemble other manuscripts that were dated in the same way, using the same criteria within the same assumed timeline. The method continues to produce internally consistent results, but consistency should not be confused with verification. a system can be coherent and still be wrong. The problem is not that paleography is incapable of identifying similarities or classifying scripts. The problem is that those similarities are routinely translated into chronological certainty without sufficient external anchors for periods where the historical and material record is thin, precisely the period in which the Dead Sea Scrolls are placed. This translation becomes translation becomes speculative rather than demonstrative. If the Dead Sea Scrolls belong closer to the 2nd or early 3rd century AD, as argued throughout this work, then paleographic dating does not merely require adjustment at the margins, it collapses as a foundational chronological tool for the period because the scrolls function as a central reference point for dating other manuscripts. Any significant shift in the placement reverberates outward, destabilizing the broader framework used to reconstruct the textual history of Judaism and early Christianity. The result is not minor correction, but a forced reevaluation of the entire 2nd century textual landscape. Questions that have long been settled by appeal to paleography must be reopened. Assumptions about textual diversity, transmission, and development must be reconsidered. Before those larger implications can be addressed, however, the method itself must be examined. Its assumptions, its limitations, and the degree to which it has been asked to do work it was never designed to perform. At its core, paleography is a form of comparative patterns recognition. It does not function like a laboratory test, nor does it generate dates through measurement or calculation. Instead, it operates by observing visual features in handwriting and comparing them to similar features in other manuscripts. From these perceived similarities, chronological relationships are inferred. In practical terms, a manuscript is examined for a range of scribal characteristics, including but not limited to letter shapes, such as the curvature, angularity, or proportional balance of individual characters, strokes order and thickness, reflecting pen pressure, writing speed, and tool use, spacing and alignment, including word separation, line regularity, and marginal discipline, and ligature and stylistic habits, such as how letters are joined, abbreviated, or ornamented. These elements are then compared against a body of manuscripts already assigned to particular periods. If a manuscript's script resembles those believed to belong to a given century or half-century, it is placed within that same range. The more closely it resembles the established example, the narrower the proposed date range tends to become. This process is often described using technical vocabulary, hands, styles, families, formal versus informal script, which can give the impression of precision, yet the underlying mechanism remains analogical rather than empirical. Paleography does not identify a date embedded in the manuscript itself, it identifies resemblance to other objects whose dates are presumed. Crucially, paleography does not measure time directly, it measures similarity. Time enters the process only as an interpretive step introduced after the visual comparison has already been made. The method assumes that similarity implies contemporaneity, and that the divergence implies chronological distance. These assumptions may hold under certain conditions, particularly when large quantities of securely dated material are available. When those conditions are absent, the methods become increasingly inferential. Get out here, cat. This distinction is essential. Paleography can describe what a script looks like and how it compares to other scripts. It cannot, on its own, demonstrate when the manuscript was written. Any chronological claim produced by paleography is therefore contingent not on the manuscript alone, but on the reliability, dating, and representativeness of the comparative corpus against which it is measured. Understanding this limitation is not a rejection of paleography, it is a clarification of its scope. Only by recognizing what paleography actually does can its conclusions be weighed appropriately within broader historical and textual arguments. The most serious weakness of paleography is not subjectivity or imprecision, but circularity. The method relies on comparison, yet the objects being compared are rarely anchored to independent, externally verifiable dates. Of the few verified dates, several are questioned to be of the date derived from the text, such as the Bar Kokhba letter and the sale of a cow. As a result, paleographic dating often operates within a closed system that reinforces its own assumptions. In practice, manuscripts are dated paleographically by being compared to other manuscripts that were themselves dated paleographically. The process unfolds in a similar sequence. Manuscript A is assigned a date range based on perceived stylistic features and an assumed developmental trajectory of a script forms. Manuscript B is then dated by the resemblance to manuscript A, on the assumption that similar handwritings imply temporal proximity. The similarities between A and B is subsequently cited as confirmation that both belong to the same proposed period. At no point in the sequence does time enter as an independently measured variable as a measured variable. Chronology is inferred at every stage, never demonstrated. The system produces agreement, but the agreement is generated internally rather than tested against external controls. This circularity is often obscured by the accumulation of data when dozens or hundreds of manuscripts are grouped into overlapping paleographic ranges. The resulting coherence can appear persuasive, yet coherence alone does not establish accuracy. A closed loop can remain stable even if its initial assumptions are flawed. Once a paleographic framework is accepted, new manuscripts are almost inevitably absorbed into it, reinforcing the appearance of continuity and gradual development. The problem becomes especially acute in periods where securely dated comprenda are secure. For the centuries surrounding the turn of the era, very few Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek manuscripts contain explicit dates, inscriptions, administrative documents, and archaeological context that might serve as a firm anchor are limited, disputed, or unevenly distributed. In their absence, paleography fills the gap, but it does not by extending its an influential chain rather than by introducing new evidence. Without independent anchors, such as securely dated inscriptions, documents bearing explicit chronological markers, or uncontested archaeological strata, paleography becomes internally coherent. By externally unverified, bleh, it becomes internally coherent, but externally unverified. It can explain its own results, but it cannot validate them. The methods continue to function not because it has been confirmed, but because there is nothing outside the system to change it. This circular structure does not render paleography useless, but it does set strict limits on what it can legitimately claim. When paleographic conclusions are treated as foundational rather than provisional, the method ceases to be a tool of analysis and becomes a mechanism of assumption, quietly shaping historical reconstructions while remaining largely immune to falsification. For the period between roughly 200 BC and AD 200, the number of securely dated Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts is extremely small. Even within Greek material, where the documentary record is broader, the number of texts that can be confidently dated by explicit internal evidence or uncontested archaeological context remains limited. The result is a comparative record that is far thinner than is often assumed when paleographic claims are presented with precision. Paleography depends on the availability of dense and well-distributed body of comparenda in periods where numerous manuscripts can be securely dated. Patterns of scribal development can be observed with some confidence. Variations can be mapped, transitional forms identified, and broad stylistic trends traced over time. For the centuries surrounding the turn of the era, however, those conditions do not exist. Instead, scholars are often working with a small number of anchor points spread unevenly across regions and genres. This scarcity produces two interrelated problems. First, styles can be demonstrated to evolve linearly. Paleographic models often assume gradual and progressive change. Earlier scripts give way to later ones through a sequence of intermediate forms, but without sufficient data points, this progression cannot be demonstrated. It is merely presumed. Apparent developments may represent nothing more than the survival of a certain sample over of yeah, try that again. Apparent developments may represent nothing more than the survival of certain samples over others. Gaps in the record are routinely bridged by assumption, with missing stages inferred rather than observed. Second, regional variation cannot be reliably distinguished from chronological change. Scribal practice is shaped by far more than time alone. Geography, educational tradition, institutional setting, and even individual preference all exert significant influence on how a hand appears. A scribe trained in Egypt may write very differently from one trained in Judea or Syria, even if they are contemporaries. Conversely, a conservative scribal tradition in one region may preserve forms that appear older than when compared to a script from elsewhere. When I don't like this word. When comparenda are sparse, paleography lacks the resolution to distinguish these variabilities. Differences in letter forms or spacing may reflect regional schools, sectarian habits, or deliberate stylistic choices rather than chronological distance. Yet, in the absence of sufficient data, such differences are often interpreted as temporal markers by default. The problem is compounded by genre. Religious manuscripts, legal texts, and literary works may follow different scribal conventions than administrative or documentary material. Comparing across these categories introduces additional uncertainty, especially when the surviving corpus is small and uneven. In this context, paleographic dating becomes increasingly fragile. What is presented as a refined chronological judgment may in fact rest on a handful of examples expo- expo- extrapolated beyond what the data can sustain. The method continues to function, but its precision is illusory, its conclusions constrained not by what the evidence demonstrates, but by what the evidence fails to rule out. This limitation is not incidental, it is structural. When the comparative base is thin, paleography cannot reliably separate age from place, or development from diversity. The method may still classify scripts, but its ability to assign them to specific decades or even generations becomes deeply questionable. One of the most persistent assumptions underlying paleographic dating is the handwriting naturally progresses forward in time. That older forms gives way to newer ones in a largely irreversible sequence. while this assumption may hold in certain documentary contexts, it breaks down in the transmission of religious texts, especially scripture. Religious manuscripts are not neutral carriers of information. They are produced within communities that prize continuity, authority, and fidelity to inherited tradition. In such settings, scribes are often trained not to innovate but to preserve. Older letter forms, spacing, conventions, and stylistic habits are deliberately retained as markers of legitimacy and reverence. The goal is not efficiency or modernization, but continuity with the authoritative past. This phenomenon, in, this phenomenon, institutional anchor archaism, is well attested across cultures that across cultures and periods in liturgical, legal, and sacred contexts. The conservative scripts are often maintained long after newer styles have emerged elsewhere. What appears old in form may in fact be quite recent in origin, preserved precisely because of its perceived antiquity. In such cases, visual resemblance to earlier manuscripts reflects choice rather than age. For paleography, this presents a fundamental problem. The method relies on the assumption that similarities implies contemporaneity or contemporaneity. But when scribes consciously imitate earlier styles, that relationship is severed. A manuscript produced in AD 200 may deliberately resemble one written in AD 50, not because it belongs to the same period, but because its producers wished it to appear traditional, authoritative, or continuous with an earlier textual lineage. Paleography has no reliable mechanism for detecting this motive. The method can observe resemblance, but it cannot determine whether that resemblance is the result of temporal proximity or deliberate imitation. Stroke order, letter shapes, and layout can all be preserved in intentionally. From a poorly visual standpoint, a conservative script and an earlier script may be indistinguishable. This limitation is especially acute in the case of biblical and sectarian texts, where fidelity to tradition is often elevated above stylistic innovation. The more sacred the text, the stronger the incentive to resist change. As a result, the very manuscripts most frequently subjected to paleographic dating are also those most likely to undermine its assumptions. In such contexts, paleographic dating becomes asymmetrical. It can detect novelty more easily than conservatism. A clearly innovation a clearly innovative script may suggest a later period, but a conservative script does not generate an earlier one. The absence of visual innovation cannot be equated with antiquity. Recognizing scribal conservation does not invalidate paleography outright, but it sharply limits its chronological reach. When deliberate archaism is possible, and in a religious context, it often is paleography. Yeah, it often is. Let's try that again. When deliberate archaism is possible, and in religious context, it often is. Paleography loses its ability to function as a primary dating tool. What remains is classification without chronology, resemblance without temporal certainty. Within the paleographic framework used to date Second Temple and early biblical manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls occupy a frequently stabilizing role. They are not merely one corpus among many, they function as a chronological keystone. Once their date ranges are accepted, they provide reference points against which a wide array of other manuscripts are measured. Styles identified within the scrolls becomes benchmarks. variation observed elsewhere are interpreted in relation to them. The stabilizing role is often implicit rather than explicit. Paleographic studies routinely describe scripts as early, middle, or late within the Second Temple period, with the Dead Sea Scrolls serving as its central dis- distribution around which these categories are organized. Even when individual manuscripts are often directly compared to specific scrolls, they are situated within a framework whose boundaries have been defined by assumed antiquity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As a result, the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls does not merely affect interpretations of the scrolls themselves, it anchors the broader paleographic system. Greek Greek biblical manuscripts, Hebrew fragments, and related textual traditions are all calibrated directly or indirectly against the same chronological scaffolding. Once the keystone is set, the structure above it appears stable. The consequence of this dependence is straightforward, but often unacknowledged. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are misdated, if they belong closer to the 2nd or early 3rd century AD rather than the 1st century BC, then the entire system built upon them must shift accordingly. Manuscripts previously assigned to earlier periods by resemblance to the Dead Sea Scroll script would also move forward in time. The apparent depth of textual history would compress, the assumed antiquity of certain forms would evaporate. Paleography often yeah, Paleography offers no internal resistance to such a shift because it operates through relative comparison rather than absolute measurement. It can accommodate a revised baseline without contradiction. The same similarities, the same grouping, and same classification would remain intact, only the dates attached to them would change. What was once labeled 1st century BC would simply become 2nd century AD. This this malleability is not a strength in this context, it is a warning. A dating system that can absorb a century scale shift without methodological distribution is not anchored to time in any robust sense. Its conclusions are only as secure as the assumptions that established its reference points. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are allowed to function as a keystone without independent verification, then paleography becomes less as a tool for discovering chronology and more a mechanism for preserving it. The framework appears stable precisely because it is self supporting. When the keystone is questioned, the structure does not define itself, it moves. If paleographic baselines are moved forward, the consequences are not confined to the dating of the few isolated manuscripts. The effect cascades across the entire reconstruction of early textual history because paleography underwrites so many chronological assumptions. Even a modest shift at the foundations produces widespread realignment. First, First, early biblical manuscripts cluster later. Texts long treated as witness to pre Christian or early 1st century traditions would no longer occupy that position. Their apparent antiquity would be revealed as relative rather than absolute, depend, dependent on comparison to a misdated baseline. What had been assumed to represent the textual landscape before Christ would instead reflect developments taking place well into the 2nd century. Second, the perceived gap between autographs and surviving copies narrows artificially. Under the traditional model, paleography helps create the impression of a long and largely invisible transmission period separating original compositions from the manuscripts that preserve them. If the dating framework shifts forward, that gap contracts, not because new manuscripts appear, but because the existing ones are no longer pushed back in time. The distance between composition and preservation becomes shorter, and the 2nd century assumes a far more direct role in shaping the text that later generations inherited. Third, the supposed explosion of textual diversity before Christ dissolves. Much of what is described as early textual plurality multiply versions of ugh, let's try that again. Much of what is described as early textual plurality multiply versions, expressions, omissions, and variant readings is assigned to the pre-Christian era largely on paleographic grounds. If those grounds are unstable, the diversity itself must be relocated. Rather than reflecting ancient and chaotic textual environment, many variations may instead belong to a period of active editing, harmonization, and theological negotiation in the 2nd century. Finally, the 2nd century emerges as a far more creative and formative than is currently admitted. Instead of functioning primarily as a period of reception and preservation, it becomes a central engine of textual development. Scribal activity, editorial decisions, and competing theological interests take on heightened significance. The stability traditionally projected backwards into the 1st century is revealed as the product of later consolidation. In short, paleography has been used to push textual instability backward in time, relocating text complexity and diversity into an earlier, less accessible past. By doing so, it insulates the 2nd century from scrutiny and preserves the appearance of early textual fixity. When paleographic assumptions are reevaluated, that insulation disappears. The 2nd century can no longer be treated as a passive bridge between ancient originals and later tradition, but must be confined as a decisive period in formation of texts themselves. Paleography persists not because it is uniquely strong, but because it is necessary. For large portions of early manuscripts history, especially in the centuries surrounding the turn of the era, there are few alternative means of assigning dates. Manuscripts lack coliforms, archaeological contexts are often disturbed, ambiguous, or unavailable. Independent chronological anchors are rare. In this vacuum, paleography fills a practical need. Without it, vast stretches of early textual history would remain undated or only loosely contextualized. Scholarly narratives depend on chronological ordering. Text must be placed somewhere in time in order to be discussed, compared, and interpreted. Paleography offers Paleography supplies that ordering, even when the evidentiary basis is thin. It continued it continued use reflects methodological necessity more than methodological certainty. Over time, however, this necessity has hardened into confidence. What begins as provisional solution gradually becomes a default assumption. Date ranges originally proposed with caution are repeated, refined, or and cited until they acquire the appearance of established fact. Subsequent works builds upon these dates, often without re-examining the assumptions that produced them. Confidence, once institutionalized, hardens into dogma. Paleographic frameworks become embedded in reference works, museum labels, academic cir- uh, circul- circular that fancy word, but that's academic, and peer-reviewed expectations. They are no longer treated as hypotheses to be tested, but as fixed boundaries within which legitimate discussion must occur. Alternative chronologies are not merely debated, they are often excluded as methodologically improper by definition. At this stage, challenging paleographic conclusions threatens more than individual dates. It destabilizes entire scholarly ecosystems built upon them. Chronologies, textual stemata, historical reconstructions, and interpretive models that assume a settled timeline. Revising the framework would require reconstructing decades of scholarly literature, recontextualizing well known manuscripts, and reopening questions thought to be resolved. The persistence of paleography, therefore, is not primarily a story of deception or bad faith, it is a story of dependence. A method adopted to solve a practical problem becomes indispensable, and indispensability gradually shields it from subsequent critique. The more work paleography is asked to do, the harder it becomes to question whether it was ever situated to do that task. Recognizing this dynamic does not undermine scholarship, it clarifies its constraints. Only by distinguishing between what paleography supplies out of necessity and what it can actually demonstrate can the method be placed back into proportion. I'm not arguing that paleography is useless, illegitimate, or without value. I am arguing that paleography has been mispositioned. When treated as a supporting method, it can contribute meaningfully to manuscript studies. When treated as foundational chronological authority, when treated as a foundational chronological authority, it exceeds its proper scope. Paleography is more effective when it operates within well documented periods where abundant, securely dated material exists. In such contexts, it can help distinguish broad phases of scribal practice and identify relative relationships among manuscripts. It can clarify whether a hand belongs closer to one group than another, or whether a script reflects a continuity or the divergence within a known tradition. Properly constrained, paleography can distinguish rough periods when comparative data is abundant, allowing scholars to group manuscripts into broad chronological zones rather than precise dates, and identify relative similarity within known corpora, helping to map relationships and transmission patterns among texts already anchored by independent evidence. These are valuable contributions. They allow for classification, comparison, and internal coherence within a manuscript tradition. They do not, however, establish chronology on their own. Paleography can not anchor early centuries independently, especially when securely dated comprenda are sparse or absent or override textual, historical, or theological evidence, particularly when such evidence points in a different chronological direction. When paleographic conclusions conflict with external data, whether literary testimony, historical context, or internal textual signals, the conflict cannot be resolved by paleography alone. To do so is to evaluate resemblance over evidence and inference over demonstration. Representation, repositioning paleography as a secondary tool restores balance to the field. It allows the method to inform discussion without dictating it, and to support conclusions rather than predetermine them. Chronology must emerge from the convergence of multiple lines of evidence, not from a visual analysis of handwriting in isolation. This recalibration does not weaken manuscript studies, it strengthens them by aligning the method with capability. Paleography remains useful, but only when it is asked to do what it can actually do and no more. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated closer to AD 200, paleography does not rescue the traditional timeline. It collapses alongside it because paleographic dating operates relationally rather than independently. It cannot stabilize a chronology once its central reference points are shifted. The same visual similarities remain, but the chronological meaning dissolves. What changes is not the handwriting, but the story told about it. The result of this collapse is not chaos, but clarity. Removing paleography from its role as a foundational dating authority exposes assumptions that have long structured the study of early manuscripts without being adequately examined. Chronological confidence gives way to historical honesty rather than forcing the evidence into an inherited framework. The framework itself becomes subject to review. In this light, the second century emerges not as a passive recipient of ancient traditions, but as an active engine of textual formation. It becomes a period of transmission, selection, editing, and consolidation, one in which theological commitments, communal identities, and interpretive strategies shaped shaped the text that would later be treated as settled. The apparent stability projected backward into the first centuries is revealed as the product of later pressures, as later processes rather than their source. This reevaluation does not deny continuity with earlier traditions, nor does it require wholesale innovation. It simply re, relocates creative and editorial energy to a period better documented by historical conflict, institutional development, and textual negotiation. The second century can bear that weight precisely because it was a time of intense literary and theological activity. Rather than asking why paleography disagrees with this model, the more revealing question is why paleography was ever trusted to do work it was never equipped to perform. Handwriting can resemble the past, it can imitate it, preserve it, and even institutionally invoke it. History, however, does not operate by resemblance. It unfolds through events, decisions, and contexts that must be established by evidence beyond appearance. Once this distinction is recognized, paleography can be restored to its proper place, useful, informative, and limited. The second century, freed from artificial chronological compression, can then be studied not as a footnote to earlier traditions, but as a formative chapter in its own right.